Millions of homeowners don't realize this yet, but the biggest threat to their home in the coming years may not be a market crash, rising interest rates, or even inflation. It may be the law itself. In 2026, a wave of new rules is set to reshape how homes are owned, valued, and kept, and for many people on fixed incomes or living in fully paid-off properties, the costs won't come as a monthly bill, they'll come as a shock. Quiet policy changes, regulatory drafts, and housing reforms are already moving through the system, largely unnoticed by the public. This isn't about panic or fear. It's about understanding what's changing before deadlines arrive, letters land on doormats, and options quietly disappear. Some pressures are visible, others are hidden, and those are the ones forcing the hardest decisions. Number 1. Why 2026 changes everything. 2026 is not just another year on the calendar for homeowners. It is the point where multiple legal timelines collide. Over the past few years, governments and regulators have introduced laws with delayed enforcement dates, phased targets, and transitional grace periods. Many of those countdowns end in 2026. Energy efficiency standards tighten, tax frameworks adjust, care funding rules expand, planning powers evolve, and lending criteria are reassessed, not one at a time, but all within the same narrow window. On their own, each change may appear manageable. Together, they create a level of pressure that many households have never faced before. This is why 2026 feels different. It is not a sudden shock, but the moment when long-planned policies finally move from paper into everyday life. What makes this shift especially dangerous is the cumulative effect. Most homeowners budget for known expenses: council tax, utilities, insurance, and maintenance. But when several new compliance costs arrive simultaneously, upgrades, reassessments, insurance changes, legal reviews, the financial strain compounds. A household that could absorb one new cost may struggle with 3 or 4 arriving at once. This pressure is particularly severe for people on fixed or predictable incomes, such as retirees, semi-retired workers, or long-term homeowners who bought when rules were far simpler. For them, the home is no longer just a place to live. It becomes a regulatory asset that must constantly meet new standards to remain viable. Crucially, 2026 represents a structural shift, not a temporary disruption. These laws are not designed to be rolled back quickly, nor are they responses to short-term market conditions. They are part of long-term strategies tied to climate targets, public spending reforms, demographic change, and housing supply management. Once these systems are in place, they tend to tighten further rather than loosen. That is why this moment matters so much. It marks the transition from an era where owning a home largely meant stability, to one where ownership increasingly comes with ongoing legal, financial, and compliance obligations. For many, the challenge is not losing their home overnight, but slowly being priced out of keeping it. Number 2. Energy rules. Energy efficiency rules are becoming one of the most powerful forces reshaping home ownership, especially as stricter requirements move closer to full enforcement. What began as guidance and long-term targets is now turning into hard thresholds that properties must meet to remain compliant. Homes with poor insulation, outdated heating systems, single glazing, or inefficient layouts are increasingly viewed not just as less desirable, but as legally problematic. These rules are often justified through climate goals and national energy strategies, yet for many homeowners, the real impact is financial rather than environmental. When compliance shifts from recommendation to obligation, the cost burden lands directly on the individual household. Older homes are hit hardest by these changes. Properties built decades ago were never designed with modern efficiency standards in mind, and retrofitting them is rarely simple. Wall insulation, roof upgrades, new windows, heat pumps, ventilation systems, and electrical modifications can quickly run into tens of thousands. In some cases, structural limitations make full compliance difficult or even impossible without major reconstruction. For homeowners who bought long ago and have already paid off their mortgages, these costs arrive as an unexpected second price for the same home. The house itself hasn't changed, but the rules governing it have, and that shift can turn a comfortable living situation into a financial strain almost overnight. This is where the pressure becomes decisive. When homeowners compare the cost of upgrades with the value of their property, selling can begin to look like the more rational option. For people on fixed incomes, taking on debt to fund energy improvements may not be feasible. For others, grants and subsidies may cover only a fraction of the required work, leaving large gaps to be filled privately. Over time, the choice narrows: invest heavily to keep a home compliant, or exit the property before restrictions tighten further. In this way, energy rules don't force sales directly, but they reshape the economics of ownership so profoundly that selling becomes the path of least resistance. What appears on the surface as an environmental policy quietly becomes a housing pressure, one that many homeowners are only beginning to fully understand. Number 3. Property taxes. Property taxes are often viewed as a background expense, predictable, familiar, and relatively stable. But that assumption is starting to break down as revaluations and structural changes quietly reshape how homes are taxed. In many areas, long-standing property bans are being reviewed to better reflect current market values rather than historical purchase prices. On paper, this may sound like a technical adjustment. In reality, it can trigger sharp increases in fixed annual charges, even for homeowners who have not moved, renovated, or changed their circumstances in any way. A home that has simply existed through decades of rising prices can suddenly be treated as a far more expensive asset than the owner ever intended it to be. The impact of these changes falls hardest on retirees and those living on fixed or limited incomes. For many older homeowners, the mortgage is long gone, and the house represents security rather than wealth. Monthly budgets are built around pensions, savings, or part-time income, with little room for sudden increases in unavoidable costs. When property taxes rise, there is no easy adjustment. Unlike discretionary spending, these charges must be paid regardless of income fluctuations. Over time, even modest annual increases can compound into a serious burden, especially when combined with other rising costs such as utilities, insurance, and maintenance. What makes property tax pressure particularly unsettling is that it increases the cost of staying put. Homeowners are not upgrading, relocating, or improving their quality of life, yet their housing costs continue to climb. This creates a sense of being priced out of one's own home without any visible trigger. Downsizing or selling begins to feel less like a lifestyle choice and more like a financial necessity. For some, releasing equity becomes the only way to manage ongoing expenses. For others, selling altogether appears to be the only way to regain control over monthly finances. In this way, property taxes do not force people out through dramatic action, but through steady, unavoidable pressure. The home remains the same, but the cost of keeping it quietly rises year after year, until staying becomes harder than leaving. Number 4. Inheritance laws. Inheritance laws are increasingly redefining how family homes are viewed, shifting them from emotional anchors into financial instruments that must be actively managed. In the past, many homeowners assumed their property would naturally pass to children or relatives with minimal interference. That assumption is becoming far less secure. As governments look for sustainable ways to fund public services and manage wealth distribution, homes are being treated more aggressively as taxable and assessable assets. Thresholds, exemptions, and allowances that once protected family properties are tightening, and the result is that inheritance planning now starts much earlier than most families expect. This shift forces difficult conversations long before families feel ready for them. Adult children may find themselves discussing property values, future tax liabilities, and potential sale timelines while parents are still living independently in their homes. For many households, this creates pressure to act sooner rather than later, transferring ownership, restructuring assets, or selling property years ahead of original plans. These decisions are rarely straightforward. Moving assets can trigger tax consequences of their own, while holding onto property may increase future liabilities. Families are left weighing complex financial trade-offs against deeply personal attachments to a home that represents decades of memories and stability. The strain is not only financial, but emotional. A family home is rarely just a line on a balance sheet. It carries identity, history, and a sense of continuity. When inheritance rules make that home feel like a ticking liability rather than a legacy, the emotional toll can be heavy. Parents may feel guilt over leaving potential burdens to their children, while children may feel pressure to push for decisions that clash with family sentiment. In many cases, selling the home earlier than planned becomes a way to reduce uncertainty and regain control, even if it means letting go of something deeply meaningful. In this environment, inheritance laws do not merely shape estates after death. They influence living arrangements, family relationships, and housing decisions years in advance. What was once assumed to be a stable inheritance increasingly becomes a complex, time-sensitive choice, forcing families to balance emotion and economics in ways they never anticipated. Number 5. Landlord exits. The quiet exit of small landlords is becoming one of the most disruptive forces in the housing market, and its effects reach far beyond the rental sector. Increasing regulation, tighter tax treatment, and rising compliance costs have made owning a single rental property far less attractive than it once was. For many small landlords, especially those who relied on rental income to supplement pensions or savings, the numbers no longer add up. Rather than absorb mounting obligations and shrinking margins, many are choosing to sell. When this happens at scale, the impact is not gradual. It ripples through entire local markets. As more rental properties are listed for sale, supply increases sharply in specific areas, often faster than demand can adjust. This sudden surge can destabilize prices, particularly in neighborhoods with high concentrations of buy-to-let ownership. Homes that once sold easily may linger on the market, forcing sellers to accept lower offers. While this might appear to benefit buyers, it creates uncertainty for existing homeowners whose property values are tied to local conditions. Even those who have no connection to the rental market can see their home's value affected simply because of where they live. Price pressure is only part of the story. Landlord exits can also change the character of communities, affecting services, schools, and infrastructure planning. Areas that experience rapid turnover may struggle with inconsistent occupancy and reduced investment, further weighing on desirability and long-term value. For owner-occupiers, this creates a difficult position. A home is not just a private asset, its value is shaped by the surrounding market. When that market becomes unstable, homeowners may feel compelled to act defensively, selling earlier than planned to preserve equity or avoid being caught in a prolonged downturn. In this way, landlord exits do not force homeowners to sell through regulation, but through indirect pressure. Falling prices, slower sales, and changing neighborhood dynamics can narrow future options. For some, the decision to sell is not about wanting to leave, but about timing, choosing to move while conditions still allow control, rather than waiting until market forces make the decision for them. Number 6. Climate risk. Climate risk is no longer a distant or abstract concern for homeowners. It is becoming a concrete factor that directly affects whether a property can be realistically owned at all. As climate models improve and historical data is reevaluated, flood maps and risk zones are being updated with far greater precision. Areas once considered low or moderate risk are being reclassified, sometimes overnight. These changes don't require a flood to happen. The designation alone is enough to trigger consequences. Planning restrictions tighten, resale becomes harder, and most critically, insurance companies begin to reassess their exposure. Insurance is where climate risk turns from theory into financial reality. In higher risk zones, coverage can be withdrawn entirely or offered only at sharply increased premiums. Excesses rise, exclusions multiply, and policies become more restrictive. For homeowners, this creates a serious problem. Mortgage lenders, local authorities, and even utility providers often require valid insurance as a condition of ownership or service. When insurance becomes unaffordable or unavailable, the home itself starts to function less like a secure asset and more like a liability. Even properties that have never experienced flooding can fall into this category purely due to updated risk assessments. Over time, the cost of managing climate risk can make ownership unsustainable. Higher insurance premiums add to already rising property taxes, maintenance costs, and energy compliance expenses. Preventive measures such as flood barriers, drainage systems, or structural modifications may be recommended or required, adding further financial strain. For homeowners on fixed incomes, these layered costs can quickly exceed what is manageable. Selling the property becomes less about preference and more about necessity, a way to escape a risk profile that continues to worsen regardless of personal action. What makes climate risk especially difficult is the lack of control homeowners have over it. Unlike renovations or upgrades, risk classifications are external decisions, driven by models and policies rather than individual circumstances. A home can be well maintained, responsibly managed, and still become financially unviable simply because its risk category changes. In this environment, selling is often the only way to regain certainty, as staying means accepting a future of rising costs and diminishing options. Number 7. Care costs. Care costs are becoming one of the most emotionally difficult pressures shaping home ownership, particularly for older homeowners who assumed their property would guarantee long-term security. As populations age and care systems face growing strain, funding models increasingly look to personal assets to cover the cost of support. In this framework, the family home is no longer treated as a protected space, but as a financial resource that can be assessed, accessed, or ultimately converted into funding. For many, this shift comes as a shock, especially when it emerges during moments of vulnerability rather than long-term planning. When care needs arise suddenly, through illness, injury, or cognitive decline, decisions must often be made quickly. At that point, the home becomes an emergency asset. Its value is measured not in memories or stability, but in how effectively it can fund care. Even when protections exist, they may be limited, conditional, or time-bound. Deferred payment arrangements can delay a sale, but they rarely remove the obligation altogether. Over time, mounting care costs accumulate against the property, narrowing future choices and increasing financial pressure on families already dealing with emotional strain. This process often forces sales that are driven by necessity rather than intention. Homeowners may have planned to stay in their property for life, or to pass it on to their children, only to find that those plans no longer align with financial reality. Families are placed in the position of weighing care quality against property retention, a decision no one wants to make under pressure. Selling the home can feel like a loss of identity as much as a financial transaction, particularly when it happens during periods of declining health or independence. What makes care costs especially powerful is their unpredictability. Unlike taxes or upgrades, they do not arrive with long notice or clear timelines. A home can move from being a place of comfort to a source of funding almost overnight. In these circumstances, selling is rarely a strategic choice. It is a response to immediate need. The house does not lose its value because of the market or the law alone, but because its role changes, from shelter to solution, leaving families with limited time and even fewer alternatives. Number 8. Planning control. Planning control is increasingly shifting away from individual homeowners and toward broader development and infrastructure priorities. As housing shortages, transport expansion, and urban densification accelerate, rezoning decisions are being made with long-term regional goals in mind rather than the wishes of those already living in affected areas. Land that was once firmly residential can be redesignated for higher density use, mixed development, or strategic projects. While these changes are often framed as progress, they can quietly strip homeowners of control over how their property is used, altered, or even retained. One of the most unsettling aspects of this shift is the growing reach of compulsory purchase powers. When land is deemed necessary for public benefit, whether for housing, transport, or regeneration, owners may be required to sell regardless of personal circumstances. Although legal processes exist, the balance of power rarely favors the individual. Homeowners may find themselves navigating complex procedures, tight timelines, and valuations they did not initiate. The sense of security that comes with ownership begins to erode when keeping a home is no longer entirely within one's control. Compensation, while guaranteed in principle, often fails to reflect the true cost of displacement. Market value assessments may not account for emotional attachment, relocation expenses, or the difficulty of finding a comparable home in the same area. In fast-changing markets, compensation can lag behind real prices, leaving sellers unable to replace what they have lost without adding debt. This gap between what is paid and what is needed creates pressure that goes beyond inconvenience. It can fundamentally alter a household's financial future. As planning control tightens, homeowners face a difficult reality. Even without an immediate order to sell, the possibility of rezoning or compulsory purchase introduces uncertainty that affects long-term decisions. Investing in upgrades may feel risky, while holding on indefinitely may expose owners to future loss of control. For some, selling early becomes a way to reclaim agency, choosing when and how to exit rather than waiting for external decisions to dictate the outcome. In this way, planning control does not always force sales outright, but it steadily reduces the space for voluntary, confident ownership. Number 9. Lending limits. Lending limits are tightening in ways that many homeowners do not notice until they need access to credit. Mortgage rules, affordability assessments, and equity release criteria are becoming more restrictive as lenders respond to economic uncertainty and regulatory pressure. What was once a straightforward option, refinancing, extending a mortgage term, or unlocking equity, is increasingly difficult, especially for older borrowers or those with irregular income. These changes are not designed to force sales, but they quietly remove the financial flexibility that allows homeowners to adapt when costs rise or circumstances change. For many households, refinancing acts as a pressure valve. It allows people to spread costs, manage unexpected expenses, or fund necessary upgrades without selling their home. When lending rules tighten, that valve closes. Affordability tests may fail due to age limits, income thresholds, or stricter stress testing. Equity release products, once promoted as a solution for later life, are also subject to tighter scrutiny, higher costs, and narrower eligibility. As options shrink, homeowners who assumed they had financial backstops discover that those routes are no longer available. The impact is especially pronounced when multiple pressures arrive at once. Rising taxes, energy upgrades, insurance costs, or care expenses might have been manageable if credit access remained open. Without it, even temporary shortfalls can become long-term problems. A homeowner may be asset-rich but cash-poor, with substantial value tied up in a property they cannot leverage. At that point, the house stops functioning as a source of security and becomes a locked container of value. When lending options disappear, selling often becomes the last viable choice. Not because the homeowner wants to move, but because no other mechanism exists to release funds or rebalance finances. This is what makes lending limits so powerful. They do not demand action directly. They constrain alternatives until only one remains. In this environment, the decision to sell is less about market timing or lifestyle change and more about necessity. Ownership without access to credit leaves little room to absorb shocks, and once flexibility is gone, even stable households can find themselves with no option but to exit the property they hope to keep. Number 10. The breaking point. The breaking point rarely arrives with a single dramatic event. More often, it is the result of laws stacking quietly in the background while costs rise and options steadily disappear. Each pressure on its own may seem manageable: a higher tax bill, an insurance increase, a required upgrade, tighter lending rules, or a reassessment of care funding. But when these pressures converge, the margin for coping vanishes. What once felt like a stable situation becomes fragile, not because the homeowner has done anything wrong, but because the system around them has changed. This is where the final trigger appears. It may be a letter announcing a new compliance deadline, an insurance renewal that triples overnight, a rejected refinancing application, or an unexpected care assessment. On paper, this trigger is only one more requirement. In reality, it is the moment when the numbers no longer work. Savings are insufficient, borrowing is no longer available, and delaying action only increases risk. At this stage, the decision is no longer about preference, timing, or long-term plans. It becomes about solving an immediate problem with the only asset capable of absorbing the shock. What makes this moment so difficult is the loss of agency. Homeownership is often associated with control, the ability to decide when to move, when to renovate, and when to pass a property on. At the breaking point, that control fades. External systems dictate deadlines, valuations, and obligations, leaving little room for negotiation. Selling is no longer a strategic choice. It is a response to accumulated pressure. The homeowner is not exiting the market because they want to, but because remaining has become unsustainable. This is how system pressure replaces personal choice. The sale of a home may appear voluntary from the outside, but internally it is driven by constrained options and accelerating costs. The property itself has not failed its owner. The framework surrounding it has changed. By the time the breaking point arrives, the outcome often feels inevitable. Not because one law demanded it, but because many laws together quietly narrowed the path until only one direction remained. If this felt close to home, you're not alone, and your perspective matters. Tell us in the comments which of these changes worries you most, or if you're already seeing signs of it where you live. Watch our previous video next, where we break down what everyday life in the UK could look like beyond 2026. We put a huge amount of research and effort into bringing you clear, honest analysis like this. If it helped you, support the channel by subscribing. It's just one click, and it helps us keep going.